Once there was an age when thousands around the world flocked to Nickelodeon parlors, theaters, and picture palaces to witness what was to them a new miracle. For this was the time of the birth of the cinema, the motion picture, the very beginning of the first truly mass entertainment industry. I suppose everyone has at least one story he read or saw at the movies which is responsible for the most vivid of his childhood nightmares. I know I have two myself. Dracula, for one, which I just didn't dare read before bedtime, and Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Now, that story seemed to have a very special hold on everyone, particularly in the first decades of this century. It seems to have been filmed more often than any other tale of terror. At least, so the records indicate. Scares, whether they stem from the workings of the supernatural or from science run amok or from the perversity of human nature, have been staples of the cinema from the very beginning. It's easy to see why, too, you know. You sit in the dark, and the screen offers a light comparable, I suppose, to that of the ancient campfire, where doubtless some of the first versions of the stories about monstrous behavior were invented. Before these stories, when they're well told, we're all just like children, feeling again the shivers of a primal fear, an emotion we probably first knew when someone read us an especially chilling fairy tale. The cinema arrived at the end of a century that had already done much to give concrete form to the great folklore of fairy tale. Artists like Edmond Dulac had illustrated the traditional fables that were first collected in the 17th century by Charles Perrault. In the 19th century, there had been new collections by the brothers Grimm and by Hans Christian Andersen. When Georges Méliès, a magician who took up the cinema, began to make story films, it was natural for him to turn to fairy tales of Perrault, Bluebeard, Coppelia, Cinderella. Méliès delighted in devising technical means to realize the impossible. Dancing skeletons, dismembered bodies, giants, and monsters. These are his sketches for the ice giant, which he created to provide the climax of his epic adventure, The Conquest of the Pole, made in 1912, at the height of popular interest in polar exploration. Mellier's purpose was to amuse, not to horrify. For the temperance movement, however, it was vital to instill horror at the effects of excessive drinking, which had become an acute international social problem. In A Man and His Bottle, made in 1908, the British director Cecil Hepworth tried to represent in pictures the psychological horrors of an alcoholic. Such visitors from the subconscious had long been familiar in the films of Georges Méliès. As early as 1902, he had realized an enchanting dream in his trip to the moon. Such flights of his imagination had a worldwide influence, which meant that they were imitated by any and every filmmaker who had the skill to do so. So, at the Edison Studios in 1910, the American director Edwin S. Porter made his own trip to Mars. The inventor of an anti-gravity powder incautiously sprinkles it on his waistcoat and is borne into the clutches of the Martians. A century earlier, a young Englishwoman, Mary Shelley, had created a new and frightening kind of grown-up fairy tale. In 1816, with her husband-to-be, the romantic poet Shelley, She was by the shores of Lake Geneva. Their heads were filled with ghosts and supernatural goings-on, and one night, Mary Shelley had a nightmare of a hideous being that appeared at her bedside, a creature that was living, yet created by man. The next morning, she began to write the story of Frankenstein, the scientist who gave life to an artificial being. The book was already a classic in 1910 when it was made into the cinema's first true horror film. For over 60 years, this remarkable film was thought to have been totally lost. In 1910, it was described in the catalog of the Edison Company, which made it, as the most weird, satisfying, and fascinating ever shown. Many repulsive situations, they hastily added, have been eliminated. All the same, many exhibitors found the film too horrid to show their patrons. Another of the great grown-up horror stories, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, was again based on a nightmare experienced by its author, Robert Louis Stevenson. In 1885, he dreamed he saw a man swallow a potion which unleashed all the most deformed impulses of his inner mind. In the novel, the potion becomes an addiction, until Dr. Jekyll finds himself inescapably turning into his alter ego, Mr. Hyde. The story became a great favorite with filmmakers. It was filmed no less than 8 times between 1908 and 1920 alone. This is the 1911 version. Dr. Jekyll is played by James Cruise, who was later to become an outstanding film director in his own right. Once the drug enters his system, Jekyll discovers that there is no permanent antidote. For the early filmmakers, the attraction of the theme of the divided self lay in the possibility of achieving magical effects by trick substitutions or double exposures. For the Germans, the theme of the alter ego has always had a special appeal. As the French directors turned to the French writer Perrault, so the first important German director, Paul Wegener, took his stories from German Gothic literature. Wegener's 1913 film, The Student of Prague, was taken from the tale of Peter Schlemihl by Chamisso, a contemporary of the brothers Grimm. It tells the story of a ghostly double, a man who sells his own shadow and loses his soul. Paul Wegener not only directed the film, he played both the student of Prague and his reflection, which he is tricked into selling by a demonic figure who anticipates the famous Dr. Caligari. Wegener was to become an important figure in German silent motion pictures in the 1920s, which produced some of the most memorable horror films in history. At the climax of the film, the student comes face to face with his evil reflection. But when he destroys it, he finds that he has killed himself. The instinct that makes us want to look upon horror is strange and ambivalent. The horror film is usually a parable of retribution and the punishment of evil. But the spectacle of bloodshed, the shiver up the spine, perhaps provides some strange gratification as well as moral lessons. In 1910, the Italian cinema produced a film of extraordinarily effective horror and cruelty, which purported to describe the torture of the Spanish Inquisition. It shows just how powerful the films of these early primitive years could be. The scenery may only be of canvas, and the blood and fire painted directly on the film with crimson ink. Yet the images of cruelty and terror still have the power to chill, just as they did in the darkened cinemas, the dream houses of nearly 70 years ago.